some of their concerns. What do you think was behind, that them sort of focusing in on that trend? And then I want to go to Iffath.
Yeah, so this is, when we think about demographic changes and economic growth, they are linked strongly. Because part of the source of growth is human capital.
Exactly.
And what we observe in many countries, and this is not a surprise, is that demographic changes that I would like to think they reflect good news and good changes. So there are more opportunities, better healthcare, more options for women, more decisions for households, and they are having fewer children. And globally, we're having fewer children, and we project that to continue. But that means is that the working age population, so this human capital that is vital for growth, the growth of that human capital is slowing down. And that's being reflected in the growth rates, especially for advanced and large emerging economies. So, I was thinking about this question is it aging, is it changes? And what we see is a rebalancing, from young populations to older populations. And the share of the working age population, so the share of households that are age 15 to age 64, that as a share of the population is declining, although it's declining more slowly than what you think, because as I said, there's a shift from the young to the old. And what is the meaning of this? This means societies need to start preparing for that transformation.
Absolutely.
In the recent WIO chapter, what you will see is there this drag, because of course the working age population is not growing as fast as in the past, and in some countries is already shrinking. However, we also see some good signs, because this is numbers, but there's an issue of quality and composition. So what we have seen in many countries is that labor force participation of women in particular are increasing and are offsetting part of these changes. I was looking at what happened in Spain, which is a country that you might not think has changed a lot, but it has changed dramatically. So labor force participation rates of women in Spain went from about 30% in 1990, as recent as 1990, to close to 50% today. That is a huge change to society and how society is organized.
Absolutely. And coming back to some of the fiscal piece we'll pick up on later and the debt, the more that we're able to increase labor force participation and bring more people into the workforce, into the output, into the tax paying base, the more that can help with that. So lots to pick up on. Iffath, let me come to you. We've been talking a bit about the sort of aging side. Youth employment is an issue. I worked with the team at SPJ on solutions for youth employment. It's something that is not a new challenge, unfortunately, but youth unemployment is still quite high, still 2 to 3 times the rate than adults in many countries. In this, moving towards this post-pandemic era, if you will, skills gaps, some of these challenges have been around, but what do you see as the kind of current challenges in terms of the youth employment piece and the impact of this kind of still high youth unemployment?
No, thank you, Nicole, and it's great to be here. And I just want to pick up where Mauricio left in terms of the demographic profile you were describing and the divergent demographic profile across countries, whether it's between middle income, high income, and low income. And really what we always used to think of this demographic dividend potential. But unless we think about the aging issue and youth employment issue, we're going to be facing a demographic disaster, right? And so the question that we are asking in Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice at the World Bank is, how do we translate the potential disaster into an opportunity and get back onto the dividend space? And so there, I just want to give you 2 statistics just to kind of help your viewers understand what we're talking about. In the next 30 years, in the next 3 decades, 1 in 4 European, North American, Asian resident will be above the age 65. Right? On the flip side, in the next 10 years, just in the next 10 years, you will have 1.1 billion people of the working age, entering the labor force from the global south. But in that same period, the number of jobs that are estimated to be in the market is 325 million. Right? So you are really headed to a disaster. So which means the 2 implications. One, we really need to think about jobs for youth right away, the stock of human capital that we have right now, and think of what are some of the immediate needs and some of the medium-term needs, because really looking at a very short time horizon. But at the same time, and this is something we are really trying to bring to the fore, that you need to also prepare for aging. So not all countries are there, and you always think that, oh, it's very far away, but it's not, right? And so increasingly, the majority of the aged population will be in Africa in the next 20, 30 years, right? So we are trying to sort of think of this two-pronged approach, whereby in one space thinking of what are some of the interventions that could get youth into productive jobs, thinking through some of the ways of ensuring that the returns to their education, to the human capital investments is there. At the same time, and if you don't do that, you are going to be hitting all kinds of social unrest, and you know all the issues from the evidence. But in the same way, thinking how do we help countries who are not, who are already in the aging space, but also not yet, to think about three elements, right? How do you think of long-term care for them? For how do you think about pensions reform and planning, so that all the issues you mentioned about the fiscal, the debt, and all of that is managed and is thought through as a medium-term agenda. And finally, the issue of productivity and reskilling and lifelong learning of populations, because you will have to think about how you productively use your labor force, and perhaps prolonging engagement in the labor force of your populations will be something to think about. But within that space, the other angle we're bringing about is this idea of how do you also support arbitrage in the labor markets, right? Between countries that are facing labor shortages and countries that have labor surplus, and what kind of skills needs might be needed for the sectors that are in demand and have vacancies, and we can fill that gap. So a lot of new areas of work for us to be doing along with our country partners in this space.
Really fascinating, really incredible. One of the solution areas I've heard you talk about recently, and you had an event earlier this week on jobs, about digital. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing digital interventions come in? And then I'd love to kind of bring that back to you, Mauricio, as well, on whether it's pensions and how that space interlocks with the digital and some of the financial tools that we're seeing.
So, there's digital is going to be a massive disruptor in many ways in terms of how we design interventions and how we deliver interventions, right? And so there, one of the things that we are bringing in, for example, is how do we use digital technology to help with rapidly scaling up social protection when there is a crisis? How do we use digital to have better targeting of social protection so that you can actually have progressive expenditures as countries think about fiscal reform? So we think that digital technology through digital social protection can actually be a macro-critical fiscal policy tool. Yeah. So I think this is where delivery of services become important. But digital also becomes very important as we think of skills, exactly. Right? Because currently, yes, I talked about the number of youth in the labor force that's going to come. They will not have the skills that are needed for the future jobs that are going to be. So digital as a means to have better productivity and better job outcomes is going to be very much. So here, for example, one of the things we are doing a lot and thinking about is how do we use remote platform-based work to connect young people in the global south to jobs that might be in the north. So this is a low-hanging fruit because we have the technology. It doesn't take much in terms of pulling together ways, but what will be needed from our analysis we see is social protection instruments to allow for these digital nomads to have better productivity, better risk management, and contribute to the aggregate output of countries.
It's really important, and we often associate, as you just said, the digital opportunities with young workers and youth, but it also has a lot of implications for older workers who are often less digital savvy, and sometimes we kind of forget that a lot of that digital skills, digital literacy needs to come for older workers as well, and there's been some interesting intergenerational interventions that are bringing youth and older workers together and helping kind of train each other, if you will, and mentor each other, so that's really important. So, coming back to you, Mauricio, where do you see kind of digital coming into the space that you're working in? And also, I know you've done some more work on the pension side, so I'd love you to kind of dig into that a little bit more and how those dynamics are at play.
Yes, so let me start with the digital
Great.
and how do we see it from our side at the IMF, especially from the fiscal affairs side. We see a lot of promise in the digital area, but let's not forget something very basic. 800 million people have no access to electricity, or very limited access to electricity. So those simple building blocks, and I know the bank works together with countries to expand access to electricity. Those simple interventions seem very promising to me. And I want to link this conversation to what we were talking about in the first part of our chat on demographic changes. I think here what Iffath is really stressing is not negative. This is really a huge potential.
Huge.
And the numbers that we have is that the population in sub-Saharan Africa will double from 1 billion today to about 2 billion by 2050. This extra billion population coming into a labor force, learning all the digital tools, and the important part is to equip them to have access to that. And I go back to the basics. We have, for low-income countries, we have looked at their needs to make progress along the SDGs. These are relatively basic issues. Universal education of high quality, universal healthcare of high quality, access to roads, electricity, water and sanitation, which are basic and are necessary for this digital transformation. Let's not forget about those. And we estimate that these countries will need to do very large investments, close to 16% of GDP per year, to be able to make substantial progress on that. On digitalization, I do see that it's promising because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a shrinkage or a slowing down of the working age population, but what matters is the quality of that population. So it's not only the quantity that might be shrinking, but having the education, having access to digital tools to increase productivity. And that leads me to the last point that you mentioned about the elderly. So in the elderly, I see my mother. She, for many years, could not really use a computer. As soon as Facebook comes in, she is the best at using digital tools. And she uses this for, enjoying her retirement. But I could see how elderly could use this more productively for participation actively in labor force, participation part-time, and, as you mentioned, being remote work from low-income countries to maybe more advanced economies seems very promising. So I see a lot of areas of promise in this arena.
Your enthusiasm for the opportunity in the demographic dividend is what's really driving this conversation. I mean, if you look back to the Asian economic miracle, researchers have found that as much as a third of that rapid economic growth can be attributed to their young workforces. And to the point about the aging side, I think what gets less attention is the second demographic dividend, if you will, which is when older people have been able to accumulate wealth or potentially even working longer if they choose to, but then they have that consumption, they have that wealth and they are putting it back into the economies. We're seeing that second demographic dividend, and that's something that I think is starting to get a little more attention as these countries start to age. So you talked about some of the interventions, the electricity in particular, which makes me think, and if I'm going to come back to you, IDA. The IDA 21, the replenishment this year has been probably the topic of conversation, and at least in many that I've been in. How do you connect the dots on IDA? How do you see IDA as being so important for supporting young and older people in particular in the IDA countries?
So I'm very encouraged with the discussions I've had all of this week, because in many ways, the emphasis that our own president has given to the issue of jobs for the youth and women is tremendous. The emphasis we have also as part of the G20 alliance on a fight against hunger and poverty, the emphasis on social protection as being a fundamental tool for macroeconomic better management. I've heard this in a number of delegation meetings, and I think that this is all going to really feature into IDA, because I think there's recognition that we need to do more, better, faster through digital means is very much in everyone's DNA now, which makes me very excited because in social protection and jobs, we touch all of these elements. But on top of that, we also at the World Bank have a new corporate scorecard, which is really going to help us focus and double down our efforts in many areas. One of the areas is inclusion of the poorest, where we'll have a lot of emphasis on how we do more and actually double down our efforts in social protection coverage, which I think will be helpful in many of the discussions and this includes sort of income assistance to social pensions to sort of social security work, labor market programs, and all of that I think will offer us a North Star to move. In the same vein, we also have an indicator on more and better jobs. So we're really trying to think through how we can actually measure and hold us accountable on how many jobs are we creating and how many of them are going to women, how many of them are going to the youth. So I think all of that is really giving us a framework to work within and really the license, if you will, to work with anybody, with partners, with IMF, outside the World Bank, inside the World Bank. The emphasis on collaborating across different sectors. I've just come from a discussion on food and nutrition security where we brought education, health colleagues, our agricultural colleagues, and I think I feel this is a moment for social protection and jobs because there is all that kind of focus and emphasis. So I'm really bullish going forward that with IDA 21 with us, we should be able to make some real difference.
Well, it's great to hear such optimism. I was sitting right here with Ana Verde on Monday afternoon, and we were talking about the scorecard and how important it is that several of those measures, of those indicators, do have built in that commitment to have the aggregate number as well as specifically break it down, disaggregate for youth, and to see that for women and others. So I'm going to come back to you, Mauricio, to kind of have our last few minutes here together on, we talked a little bit about fiscal policy, sort of introduced it, but I want to, picking up on some of the solutions, whether IDA and more generally private sector engagement. How do you see that kind of fiscal policy space going forward, and what are you looking to as we move ahead?
So maybe let me focus on the aging part and the pensions and the fiscal angle that is behind that.
Yeah.
So we have an aging population, and as Iffath said, not only in advanced economies, the population, although at a smaller scale, is also aging in low-income countries. And there's a question of how do you have these pension systems that are adapted to the population changes that we are seeing in the future. So what are the options? First is there anything we can do to maybe moderate aging? And I think the experience of that is very difficult. That doesn't mean we should not do more efforts to support families, to support parents, to make them easier to work. So you cannot change the quantity. It's very difficult to change fertility rates, but at least you can change how that quantity and how human resources are utilized. And I believe that providing maybe better access to healthcare, to childcare, can provide that leverage so women in particular can work longer and can be in the labor force. Second is maybe changes to the systems. In many countries, these systems are not really adaptive. And what I mean is you still have many countries that have retirement ages that have been fixed for the past decades when we know that life expectancy at older ages keeps increasing. True, not for everybody.
Right.
So we need to always think about the social safety net because some vulnerable and some low-income workers might not be able to work longer, but that we need to recognize. Yet, many people today we observe can work longer. And that takes me to even labor for participation of women. In many countries, especially in emerging economies, there's a gap in the retirement age of women that the systems create incentives to retire much earlier than men. And what that happens, it reduces the opportunity for women. Think if your retirement age is 57 as a woman and 62 for a man, which happens in many countries. Happens in my own country, in Colombia. When you are in your 50s and there's a manager being considered and you have a man and a woman, you have a woman that probably has to retire in 5 years versus a man that can retire in 10. Who will be more competitive for that job? So there are distortions in the system that need to be examined and need to be adapted for the future. The last thing is that this conversation is probably very appropriate for advanced and emerging economies, but let's not forget, in many emerging economies and many low-income economies, the issue is not the design, is that low-income and elderly have very little access to any benefit.
Right, no pensions.
So there is no pensions. There are some social pensions that have been increasing, but how do we design systems for those populations, especially in low-income countries where we know they're going to be aging and there will be a concern going forward? And I think that's where the bank and us, we work together to make sure that these systems are there, and from our perspective, they are sustainable, adequate, and efficient.
I mean, you both speak to the elements that both your institutions we've been talking about is the money bank and the knowledge bank, right? The capacity side of the IMF and the capacity building that is so important to these countries because there is such opportunity. And I thank you both for joining me to help unpack these issues. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm optimistic, as both of you are, that we can realize the demographic dividend for inclusive growth. And thank you for joining me. Thank you all for tuning in. Continue to follow our work at the Atlantic Council this week and all of our live analysis online. Please check out atlanticcouncil.org. And I wish you both a very good luck as the hours continue to dwindle, but the work continues to go on.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Nicole.
Thank you.
And I look
Thank
forward to
you.
continue being optimistic.
Absolutely, and working together.
Thank you.
Thank you.